We started this paper because we were really interested in studying whether race matters for police use of force. So, of course, many people clearly believe that race matters, right? But there's also another group of folks that think, police force incidents are rare, or that some cops just use too much force, but it doesn't have to do necessarily with race. So what we do in our paper is we're going to ask how much white officers scale up force as they go from calls in white neighborhoods to calls in Black neighborhoods compared to Black officers. So what you should be thinking is that if race isn't a factor, then both sets of officers should scale up their force in a similar manner. Okay, so for example, if calls are genuinely more dangerous in Black neighborhoods, but race isn't a factor, then white and Black officers should increase their force by the same amount as they go from calls in white to Black neighborhoods. However, what we find is what we think is really clear evidence that race matters. So white officers scale up their force by about 50% more than Black officers when they go from white to Black neighborhoods. And this difference is going to be even starker whenever you focus in on use of force with a gun. So what I mean by that is that white and Black officers fire their guns at similar rates in white neighborhoods. However, white officers are 5 times more likely to fire their gun in Black neighborhoods. Okay, so if it were the case that calls were just more dangerous, then again, we'd expect Black officers to use their gun force that much more often as well. Okay, so we also find that aggregated across all different types of neighborhoods, white officers just use force more, so 60% more than Black officers when they're being dispatched to really similar calls. And for use of force with a gun, white officers are 2 times as likely to use force with a gun. But perhaps more importantly, what we're finding is that these differences are really being driven by much higher force in Black neighborhoods. This isn't a story about officers of different experience levels, being dispatched to different neighborhoods and that driving our results. It really is a story about police officer race.
The reason we focused on 911 calls for this study is really because it enables us to solve some really difficult problems that make it hard to know whether race matters, for use of force. And I think it's useful if we discuss those problems in a little bit of detail. I mean, one challenge when studying policing is that oftentimes you only observe certain interactions. You often only observe the extreme interactions between police and civilians. But we observe all 911 calls. So you observe that a cop was dispatched to a scene, even if that scene did not end in use of force, right? And that's really important because now you don't need to make an assumption about how many interactions did we have with white and Black guys. Well, we know that there was a call. We know you dispatched an officer. We know the guy went and interacted with civilians. And so that's the way we answer that first thing. And the second part that's great about 911 calls is there are settings where officers and dispatchers don't have discretion, over which officers get dispatched to a call. There's a protocol, for example, in one of our cities, they're told to dispatch the nearest officer geographically to the call. And in the other city, they dispatch the beat officer if the beat officer is available. And then if not, they go to the nearest officer. But importantly, they're not allowing, a white cop to choose to go to the really dangerous call in a Black neighborhood. Because if that's happening, now we can't really compare what's happening with white and Black officers. And so that's how we solve that second problem of, we know in Black neighborhoods, white and Black cops are going to otherwise similar calls because we know how the protocol works, and we're able to isolate, again, what we would call the as good as random variation. I think one problem that we see is there is substantial disagreement about whether there's this, systematic race problem when it comes to police use of force. Our view is that if people don't agree on the facts of whether race matters when it comes to police use of force, then I don't see what hope there could be for progress on that issue. And we think that really a major contribution of what we're doing in this project is showing that there's a clear and transparent way, to test whether race matters in a systematic way. And again, if any city wanted to do that, we'd be happy to do the analysis. We'd do it at no cost to the city. And we really think just highlighting that this is possible. It's possible to do this in a a pretty clean, transparent way that doesn't require all the assumptions that other approaches require is a big advantage of what we're doing with the 911, data. Cities have different ways right now of dispatching officers to calls. And I think there's an open argument as to which of those is the best in some dimension. And I don't know that there's clear evidence on whether dispatching the beat officer is better than the nearest officer, is better than something where the officer volunteers for a call. We'd welcome any good evidence on that. But from our perspective, it'd be really useful if cities were to adopt protocols where officers didn't, or where officers weren't given so much discretion in which calls to go to. Because the moment you start allowing officers to choose, like, yeah, I'm going to take this call, or I'm not going to take this call, and because I don't like that situation, or whatever it is, the moment there's a lot of discretion by either the officer or the dispatcher in which officer gets sent to a call, it becomes now a nightmare to figure out which officers are the ones who are using force a lot, and which officers are the ones who aren't, versus which officers are going to the types of situations that require a lot of force. You could think about whether it makes sense to change assignments of police officers across neighborhoods. So if there are certain officers that just get nervous and get, maybe unnecessarily scared in certain types of situations, this provides us with one way of figuring out who those officers are. And you could think about assigning them to different beats around the city. And so, for example, one of the exercises we go through in our project is this hypothetical of what if you were to allocate, more Black officers to Black neighborhoods and white officers more to white neighborhoods, and how much could you reduce, overall use of force, for example? And the answer is, and you could reduce overall use of force by quite a bit. And so that's one thing that, at least, whether there's potential downsides of that, I mean, it's an open question, but that's one of the things that I think there could be discussions about, and whether or not that's a sensible thing to do. And you can also think about, again, thinking the individual officer analysis, where you ask, like, when cops go to otherwise similar situations, who's really using a lot of force, or who's really increasing their amount of force a lot as they go from white neighborhoods to Black neighborhoods. And once you identify those officers, you could think about, different types of interventions that you could do. And so one of those might be, maybe an officer training program. And I know CarlyWill is looking at that in a different context, but there are things that you could imagine doing with those officers to try to identify, do we really have a problem here? Look a little closer at those, and we'd help you figure out who to look closer at. And then also think about, what can we do to make things better for everybody? The hardest part in a lot of ways about what we did was finding cities with the right kind of 911 protocol that were also willing to share data.
I contacted a bunch of different jurisdictions and was unsuccessful in getting data from most of them. In fact, one little anecdote is that I reached out to a city, I mean, at this point, it's probably been 5 or 6 years ago, and they never responded to my public records request. And actually, I had a lawyer reach out to me more recently saying that, they were filing a lawsuit against the city because there had kind of been a pattern of them not responding to public records requests. So, something in, just raising awareness that there are these places where you're supposed to be able to get data publicly, and then hopefully encouraging them to provide data in a manner that's quick would be great, I think.
I think there are several, explanations for why we see white officers scaling up force more than Black officers as they go from white to Black neighborhoods. One of those would be a typical, like a bias type story, for example, where maybe white officers have a lower threshold for using force in Black neighborhoods compared to Black officers. And that could be for a reason of fear, right? Even though they face maybe exactly the same situation, white officers are interpreting that, as more threatening than Black officers are. And maybe that's driving that difference that we see in Black neighborhoods. But but it could also just be a straightforward racial bias story. The second one is there could be like a differential officer skills story that's at play. So maybe, so maybe Black officers are just as good as white officers at de-escalating situations in white neighborhoods, but maybe Black officers are better at de-escalating situations in Black neighborhoods than white cops are. And the third thing is we're picking up the net impact of any civilian response to officers and to officers of different races, and I think that could go in either direction. So it's possible that if a white cop shows up, behaves exactly the same as a Black cop would have in that situation, if it's true that a Black civilian responds more aggressively to that white cop, who again is behaving in exactly the same way as the Black cop would have, then that could drive some of what we're seeing. But it doesn't need to be that direction. It could actually be the other direction. It could be if a Black civilian, behaves, maybe more cooperatively, with a white officer than with a Black officer who behaves exactly the same way. Then that would actually, if we could adjust for that, the estimates would get even larger. I think, what we found is like a useful starting point of saying, well, it's clear something matters here. And let's dig a little deeper into what it is.